Welcome to the Insights CPD Series presented by Academic Action. The Insights CPD Series brings top experts and institutions together. These sessions empower education professionals to enhance learning experiences and drive positive change within their institutions. If you would like to participate in our upcoming CPD sessions or explore collaboration opportunities, connect with us on LinkedIn or visit our website to register. For institutions interested in becoming part of our network and accessing exclusive opportunities, contact us today.
Welcome to this professional development session, organized in collaboration with Aberystwyth University and Academic Action as part of our Insights CPD series. As educators, we understand the importance of fostering literacy in multilingual and multicultural contexts. Providing students with real-world experiences is a key element in helping them develop not only language skills, but also cultural awareness and global perspectives. To support this, Aberystwyth University offers an exclusive pre-university summer camp designed for international students. This immersive program allows students to experience academic workshops, cultural exchanges, and language development in Wales, a truly multilingual region of the UK. This initiative provides schools with a valuable tool to enrich their international education strategies, offering students a unique opportunity to immerse themselves in an English-speaking environment while learning from diverse global peers. If you'd like to learn more about this opportunity, feel free to contact us by emailing the address shown on the screen.
In this session, we want to use all our linguistic resources and we want to explore perspectives on literacy so that we're clear about our own starting point, so that we know exactly where we're coming from. We'll consider some of the research on literacy in multilingual contexts that's happening in different contexts in the UK and in Ireland, but also here in Aberystwyth with our partner schools. We'll look at a couple of practical examples of using picture books to develop literacy. And there will be time for some questions at the end, which we might be able to do live over Teams, or it might just be a case of writing things in the chat. So that's what we want to cover today.
Dr. Chapman, in the meantime, I can tell you we have people who are sharing the languages they have, like Arabic, English, French, Dutch. We have Russian, Kazakh, French, a variety. Most of them English and Spanish, French. So you have a huge variety of languages that people are. Someone said 50 languages in one school.
50 languages in one school. That's such a challenge, and it's such a rich opportunity. So thank you for that, Paolo. That's really helpful. First of all, I'd like you to think about what your working definition of literacy is. What does literacy mean to you? You may write in the chat, or you may just, if you're with colleagues, you may just discuss it with your colleagues. So just take a moment and think about how you would define literacy if someone asked you what it was. I'll give you a second or two to do that. I've chosen 3 definitions here, and I'm not suggesting that these are better than any others, but I've chosen 3 really so that you get a sense of how many different ways there are of thinking about literacy. One is from the National Literacy Trust, which is a UK charitable organisation that promotes literacy in children, young people and adults. The other is from Alberta Education Canada. The other is UNESCO. So I'll just give you a moment to read through those quickly. And I'm sure as you read that, there are certain parts of those definitions that will stand out for you as particularly pertinent to your context. The highlights on this slide, these are the parts of these definitions that I find particularly meaningful. And when I teach my students about literacy, this is what I tend to concentrate on. Communicate effectively and making sense of the world. And I like the part of the Alberta definition. Our understanding of literacy encompasses much more than reading and writing. Construct, communicate meaning in all aspects of daily living. The UNESCO definition reminds us of the importance of digital literacy, text-mediated information, and the digital skills and media literacy that our students are developing at the moment. So literacy is a huge area of academic interest and a huge challenge and opportunity for teachers. So let's have a look at some perspectives from the research. I'm sure some of you will be very familiar with Teresa Kremen's work, particularly her work on Reading for Pleasure in the Open University Reading for Pleasure project. But she also draws attention in her earlier work to the need to work with families and to acknowledge funds of knowledge that exist in family and community. Children and young people talk to their families in many different contexts and develop language skills around family activities. That might be gardening or cooking, but their experience of literacy within their family, which of course could be in a number of different languages, is an important aspect of their own literacy skills. Reading and writing float on a sea of talk. This is something that you will hear quoted often by literacy experts in the UK, particularly people like Deborah Myhill. Sometimes it's difficult to pin down where Britain actually wrote this, but I think we're so fond of it because in the world of literacy specialists in the UK, we like to emphasise the importance of talk. The talk comes first. It comes first in the process of language learning, and it comes first very often in the practice of language development in the classroom. That our reading and writing depend upon quality talk. In addition, of course, children and adults live in a multimodal world. We make meaning from lots of different media, not just words on a page, and not even just spoken words, still images, moving images, tactile images. Children participate in producing text in these forms and produce text in these forms themselves. And literacy research from the past 30 years has been very focused on the idea of multiliteracies, that we engage with literacy in multiple ways. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on that in the next slide. This is a diagram that I'd taken from Calancis and Cope, where they use the Venn diagram to help us to understand that situational factors underpin literacy, as well as the forms in which we all make meaning. That's children and adults. So, the community role is children learn language within their community. It's not an isolated issue, but sometimes communities and schools are not sufficiently connected. So when children recognise shop or road signs, when they use language in the context of their family's religious practice, their interpersonal relations, signing a card for a family member to mark a birthday or some other occasion, and developing their identities when they write their name. So all these different situational factors are part of children's literacy development. And of course, particularly in the school context, we think about certain forms of text that we might want them to write, but they're also reading and creating images, creating objects. And all of these different practices are part of the child's literacy experience. And to illustrate this, I like the idea of the literacy walk. Now, these pictures, and if you've got any comments on this, please write them in the chat. These pictures are pictures taken within a 15-minute walk of where I'm sitting now, but they all involve literacy. So children walking around see symbols like the hospital parking sign. They just see the letters. Even if they are in the stage of emergent literacy themselves or before they're seeing these signs around them. We're in Aberystwyth. We're a bilingual community. So when they see the traffic sign, they'll see it written in Welsh and in English. So they see the equivalence between those two languages around them in their everyday lives. Speed limit signs, seeing the use of numbers in the real world that mean something to the adults around them. Signs actually on the ground marking out a cycle lane in this case. So learning to recognise those symbolic representations of something that might be familiar to them, like a bike. Again, bilingualism. This is where the bus stop is. And more use of numbers in the real world. A bus stop is at stand 6. And shop signs. So these are signs that children see within their everyday life. And they become familiar with the written word. They become familiar, in our case, with bilingualism. Signs like this, as those of you who've walked anywhere at all with young children will know, are a provocation for talk and an understanding that literacy is something that adults do. It's important. So there are lots of different perspectives on literacy. Research has given us further insights, and I've just given you a very, very brief outline of some research overviews. But literacy develops alongside children's knowledge of the world and in their family and their community contexts as well. What I'd like to do now is to talk a little bit more about literacy in multilingual contexts. And I'll give you a brief overview of research projects undertaken in multilingual contexts in the UK and Ireland. Because I'm talking about UK and Ireland, the focus tends to be on the experience, either the experience of a bilingual community like Wales or of the experience of migrant children in their context. But first of all, I know many of you are working in multilingual contexts, so I'd like to give you the opportunity to share with us some of the challenges of developing literacy in your context. I know if I'm asking you to write in the chat, you probably haven't got time or space to write all the challenges that you face in developing literacy, but just perhaps a brief overview so that I get a sense of what you're facing when I'm talking about the experience that we work with in School of Education. So I'll just give you a minute to write something in the chat.
We have some answers already, and Regina said different alphabetic scheme and scribe.
Yeah.
Lack of staff that has strong literacy skills to teach the kids, says Priscilla. Fred, developing a strong mother tongue first. Regina says again, parents not supporting home languages.
That's an interesting one, and I will pick up on that later on. Thank you for that. That's lovely. That's really interesting, because some of those challenges are not things that we are as familiar with here, but some of them most definitely are. What I'd like to talk to you about first of all is Curriculum for Wales. This is the curriculum framework that all schools in Wales are now working with. And just a little bit of context for those people who are outside the UK, or indeed outside Wales. The schools in Wales fall into different categories. Some schools are entirely Welsh medium. Everything in the school takes place entirely through Welsh. Some schools are bilingual, where certain elements of school life are conducted in Welsh, certain elements are conducted in English. And other schools are English medium schools where children are learning Welsh. So all children in Wales are learning Welsh. I think that's fundamental. And obviously the children in Welsh medium schools are learning English. I wouldn't want to suggest that they weren't. But we've got a couple of concepts that underpin our curriculum. And the first one that I think is most present most opportunities to us is the concept of plurilingualism. Not multilingualism, we do refer to that as well, but plurilingualism opens up the world a little bit further in that the curriculum recognises that learners have varying proficiencies in languages. And it may be passive knowledge. It may be that they hear a language spoken and have the odd word, but don't actually speak it fluently. On the other hand, they may speak the language fluently. And what we want to do, using the concept of plurilingualism, is help students to make connections between the languages that they have, to appreciate how the languages are interconnected and how they can develop their skills and practice them individually or practice them together. And one of the elements that falls into this is the element of mediation, the idea of a source experienced in one language, heard, read, but then that concept is mediated from one language into another. The learner assists people in communicating. We'll see this very often with children whose home language is not the same as their school language, and they help their parents. And there is another element of this which is fundamental to our curriculum, and that's the concept of translanguaging. And in translanguaging in Wales, what we mean is receiving information in one language and presenting it in another. What I've given you there is a screenshot from our literacy framework. And the progression steps are just an indication of where children should be at certain points in their school career. So progression step 2 is halfway through primary school. 3 is when they transfer to secondary at age 11. 4 is when they move on to external examinations. And you can see from that slide, if we look at progression step 3, I can receive information in one language and adapt it for various purposes in another language. So you can see that translanguaging is not translation, because students receive the information in one language, but they don't simply reproduce the same sort of text. They will reproduce another text. So they might, for example, receive some information about healthy eating, say, and they transfer that to make an advertisement or a poster to encourage people to eat healthily. So it's not simply translation. If this is something that is of interest to you and is of value to you, then on this slide, you'll see a QR code which will enable you to download the document that's there on the screen. This was produced by my colleague, Sian Williams, and colleagues in Bangor University in North Wales as a guide to translanguaging in the classroom in Wales. Obviously, the context is Wales, but it may be that some of the ideas in the document are of value to you. So please feel free to use the QR code to get access to this document. And I'm really happy to introduce this in the middle of our session, because that sentence at the top of the slide, enabling pupils to make use of their full linguistic repertoire, is really what lies at the heart of what I'm trying to convey. That students have a lot of language knowledge, and translanguaging is one way of allowing them to make use of it. I hope you've all had the opportunity to use the QR code if you wish. Okay, I'm going to say a little bit more now about research on multilingual contexts. This is work that we have found useful in our own work in the department, so work done elsewhere in the UK and Ireland. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done by our local schools. First thing I want to draw your attention to is some work done in Sheffield, in England, the Multilingual Children's Library. And as you can see from the quotation on the slide, this library achieved more than simply being a place where people borrowed books. The Multilingual Children's Library was aimed at families from many different communities who didn't have English as their home language. And I don't know how clearly you can see it on the screen, but the title at the top of the web page is Lost Worlds with the L in brackets, suggesting the potential impact of loss of heritage language if children don't have access to books in all the languages that they use in their everyday lives. The library was established in Sheffield to supply books to families from migrant communities, which they might otherwise have had difficulty in finding. And it was also run engagement events to help families use those resources. So it's not simply there for people to walk in and borrow books and walk out again. It has become a kind of community space. You'll see the quotation on the screen is from Little and Murray, and Sabina Little of the University of Sheffield has written a number of papers around this library and has been involved in the library. And it's a very, very interesting case study of the potential of using libraries to support children from diverse backgrounds and their families. That's the crucial thing about the way the multilingual library works. It's not simply the children, but their families are there as well. Another project that I found quite inspiring, it was the Languages Connect project in Ireland, or at least part of it. Again, there's a plurilingual approach being taken here, where children are encouraged to use all their linguistic resources. And this project reported on work done in a school in Dublin, which in recent years has had a demographic change, and it's changed from being a school with mostly English-speaking pupils to a far greater variety, about 30 languages, not the 50 described by one of our colleagues on the call, but about 30 languages. And of course, this is comparable to Wales because all the children in the school are learning Irish as well. And the plurilingual approach taken in this school encouraged all the children to draw on their linguistic resources and show their knowledge of their home language in class. They weren't only required to use English or Irish in their schoolwork or their homework. They could bring their languages to school. Now, the impact of this on the children was that the children who spoke languages other than English showed excellent development in their English. But there was excellent contact with families, so it built good relationship with families. But the really interesting thing was the impact on the children who were monoglot English, because the school saw a much greater level of language awareness, and the children who spoke only English at home became much more engaged in languages in general, in learning of Irish, being enthusiastic about starting to learn French when that was introduced. So it's really interesting evidence that the plurilingual approach taken in this school benefited all the learners, not just the children with multiple languages. So it's an interesting idea that plurilingualism is a pebble in a pond, and it has ripples which go much further than you might have expected. What I want to suggest and talk about now is the National Professional Inquiry Programme. Now, this is a programme that runs in Wales where schools work with universities in order to develop a research project in the school. And these are examples of a couple of schools that we've worked with who've come up with the projects. And I have to stress, this is the school's project. We're just giving a bit of support, but it's actually the schools that do the work. The first one, the Multilingual School Library, was actually inspired by the Multilingual Library in Sheffield and by the Irish Project, where a local school with a diverse range of languages amongst the children worked with the children to identify books in languages other than English for their school library. Because the school library, plenty of books in English, plenty of books in Welsh, but not in other languages. So the children did some research to find out what kind of subjects would be popular, and to find out which languages children were most interested in reading. And they managed to source books in Tamil about football, or The Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which is a very popular series in the UK. Diary of a Wimpy Kid in Polish, and lots more. Those are just two examples. The result of this project was that the children's engagement with reading for pleasure, going back to Teresa Kremen's work that I mentioned earlier, children's engagement with reading for pleasure increased. They became more interested in reading for pleasure almost regardless of the language. So the Polish children, yes, they were reading in Polish and they were reading in English. So their reading in both languages it improved significantly. They were drawing on and supporting their funds of knowledge. They were reading books at home that their parents were enthusiastic to share with them and didn't feel as excluded by it. It's an immensely successful project where, particularly because the children took a lot of ownership of what happened and took responsibility for identifying books and working with their fellow pupils to find out what they wanted. So Multilingual School Library has been really successful. We had another professional inquiry project, which I think chimes in with a challenge mentioned by someone on the call earlier. Supporting parents who do not have school language. So in this case, supporting non-Welsh speaking parents. The school found that children, these children about 7, 8, were very enthusiastic about reading in Welsh. Then they speak English or another language at home. They don't speak Welsh at home. But in school, they're very enthusiastic about their Welsh reading books and enjoyed them very much. But when they took them home, there was a barrier because parents weren't able to help them in the same way that they would have been able to help them with an English reading book. Again, the enthusiasm was there, but the skill wasn't. To address this problem, the school spoke to the parents directly, asking them, or conducting a survey to ask them, what did they feel they needed? What would help them to support their children in reading Welsh? From these conversations, they developed a range of resources, bespoke resources that met the need of their parents. One of the things, they were using QR codes as well. And this was a really, really lovely idea where the more fluent children in the class would read the book, and then the school would video the child reading the book, link the video to a QR code and put the QR code in the front of the book. So when another child took the book home, parents could find that video of someone who was able to read that fluently, and they read together with their school colleague. There were also resources on vocabulary and pronunciation because, of course, parents had different degrees of Welsh. Some of them had very little Welsh at all. Some of them had passive knowledge but weren't very confident. So they were able to develop a range of resources so that the parents could make that link with their children reading Welsh. And it was a very successful project. And I think what's important about this, and we're very enthusiastic about the National Professional Inquiry Programme in the School of Education here, and my colleague Dr. Sianna Williams has done a lot of work on this. Its power is that the school identify the problem and conduct their inquiry to meet their needs, because these two schools are very close to each other but had very different needs, and they found solutions for themselves, working with their children and working with their parents. So this is a really, really powerful way of addressing literacy problems. As I said, we have been, as a department, we've been working on supporting parents. And I've got another QR code for you here, because here's another guide produced, again, by my colleague Sean, which has lots of excellent ideas in it for promoting, in this case, the use of Welsh amongst parents who don't speak Welsh. So although it's written for our context, I think you may well find that there are some ideas in here which are quite useful in any multilingual context. So once again, please feel free, use the QR code, and you can download this guide, which is quite a substantial document. So I'll just give you a moment to do that before I talk about one final project. Okay, so the final project that we have been involved in is a project called Cerdd Iaith, which is music language, really. And it uses music and drama to help primary school children learn Welsh, but also English, Spanish, German, French. And it's a project that's full of activities that allow children to engage with the language through the expressive arts curriculum. And it links in with Curriculum for Wales, which has a strong emphasis on cross-curricular working. So expressive arts and languages, literacy and communication working together to build children's engagement with language and build confidence, particularly. And this project was aimed especially at children in their final year of primary school before they move on to high school, where they would be engaged with more language learning than they had been in primary school. So once again, please feel free, use the QR code, and that will take you to the resource, which you may well be able to adapt to your context. We've got about 15 minutes left in our schedule. I do want to say something about picture books, but I'm just going to check in with Paolo for a moment. Paolo, are there any comments or questions that I need to address before moving on?
Well, not at the moment, not specific questions, but we encourage people to just put your questions on the Q&A, please. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to talk about something a little bit more practical now. Using wordless picture books. This is something that I feel very enthusiastic about. And, as an academic, the first thing I have to do is to show you what the research says about using picture books. Evelyn Aberystwyth has written a great deal about the use of picture books and really sees a huge potential in their use with children of all ages, actually, and wants to dispel the myth that picture books are not challenging for older children, because they can be, and I'll give you an example to demonstrate that. Wordless picture books, of course, offer us the scope of being usable in any linguistic context. And bearing in mind what I've been saying about the importance of talk and about the importance of plurilingualism, they are a rich resource for generating talk. And they offer opportunities to explore themes and ideas in whatever language or whatever mode is most appropriate without that linguistic barrier. And the teacher, of course, has the scope to provide the appropriate scaffolding and support the learner. So the first book I'm going to look at is a book by David Wiesner. Some of you may be familiar with his work, like Tuesday and Flotsam. I just wanted to show you some images from his book, Mr. Waffles. And as you look at them, think about how children can make meaning for them. What opportunities are there for children to use their full range of linguistic resources? And if you have any comments, please write them in the chat. So this is a wordless picture book, but it's actually about language. And in this image, you can see a very small spaceship, which has become the favourite toy of the title character, Mr. Waffles, who is a cat. But it's not a toy. It's a real spaceship, and it contains real tiny aliens. And you can see we've got 2 frames on this page where we can see the whole picture, the whole spaceship, but also a close-up of the aliens who have landed in this strange place and are not quite sure where they are or what's happening. When we look at pictures like this, we can think about what might children notice about this image, about the aliens looking a little confused, not frightened at the moment, because after all, they are space travelers, so this is what they expect. But they're not sure where they are. How might they feel about where they've landed? So there are lots of questions that arise and lots of opportunities for language practice, language development, generating dialogues between the aliens. The text gets even more interesting when the aliens find, without giving away too much of the story, in case anyone wants to read this book, the aliens find someone to help them, ants who live in the walls of the house. But what you can see on this screen is that the aliens' language is represented by symbols. So we have speech bubbles, typical of a comic book, but there are no words. We just have speech bubbles. And what the book shows, as you can see in the middle range of this sequence of frames, the aliens drawing pictures to represent their experience of falling into Mr. Wuffle's claws. This is a book about language. It's about how people communicate when they don't share a language. It's about using the words that you have, trying to make sense of the words that you have, using gestures, using images. And as a consequence, it has a great deal of potential for children to think about their own language and to communicate. And it is a very entertaining story. I'm going to move on to another book now that some of you may be familiar with, thinking about older children, although I'm not convinced that Mr. Wuffles is just for young children. And this is Sean Tan's The Arrival, which is used in secondary schools in the UK as a class reader. In some schools, not all schools, obviously. But some of the pages you will see are like the one on this slide with a single image on a page. But thinking about how narrative works and how novels work, we could talk about how this image shows character and setting. What is happening here? What kind of home is this? What's happening between these two people? Why can they not look at each other? It's a very rich image for thinking about setting and context in a novel. But then if we move on to the next, well, it's not the next pages, but some pages later, you can see how Tan uses small images to create narrative. Hello, did you want to say something, Paolo?
No.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's fine. So how the images show narrative developing by sequences of pictures. And again, this offers so many opportunities for talk. And the point that I hope I'm being able to make is that talk is the precursor to writing. Anyone engaging with either of these books that I've spoken about is reading. They are reading images. They're using their multimodal knowledge. They're using their knowledge of narrative and developing their knowledge of narrative. And if they can talk about what they see and how the story moves on, then that is an excellent foundation for further writing. Obviously, teachers have a role in scaffolding and supporting what children do, but these are very powerful and rich sources for children to use as a starting point. So, in summary, picture books are a flexible stimulus because when children look at resources like this, they can use the images to understand emotions and experience. And they can see that words don't always tell the whole story. Different people see the world in different ways, or intersex and aliens see the world in different ways. And images tell rich stories, but we can have rich talk around those stories. One of Theresa Cremen's key ideas in her Reading for Pleasure work is what she calls book blether. All that means is talking about books, because the talk around books engages children with books, and it helps them to build their own ideas, which then feeds into their own writing. Those complex ideas and complex communication can be presented through image, and it goes back to my quotation from the beginning: reading and writing float on a sea of talk. I will be very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that. We have another question from Pablo. He says, I'm an IB coordinator in a school in Quito, Ecuador. My question is how to make language policy a reality at an IB school. Do you have any to add on that?
Oh, that is such a difficult question, because it's so easy, isn't it, to write a language policy and as a language coordinator to have a lovely policy and no one in the school actually follows it. I think I'll go back to the point I was making about inquiry and thinking about what is it that the school as a whole wants the language policy to do, and ensure that the policy is developed collaboratively by colleagues in different departments, so that you can be sure that the language policy is doing what each department needs it to do. Because if your experience is anything like mine, sometimes there is a tendency to fall back on this is the responsibility of the language department, whereas of course all teachers are language teachers, because they're all teaching the specialist language of their own subject. So I don't have any easy answers to this, I'm afraid, but working with colleagues to build a genuine whole school policy from the bottom up rather than the top down. It's probably very idealistic.
Okay. Thank you for that. Another question from David. What kind of wordless book do you recommend to use, digital or paper?
That's a very difficult question. From speaking to students recently about digital books or paper books, I've noticed quite a heavy emphasis on paper books. Having said that, we cannot ignore the fact that often digital books are more easily accessible, and more easily shared. So again, I think it really depends on your circumstances, the resources that you have, and again, sometimes the preferences of individual children. Some children are much more engaged if they think if they're reading on a screen, and they don't actually realise that they're reading because it's on a screen. But others still want a book in their hand, and I am conscious that a lot of the answers I'm giving, I'm not coming down heavily on one side or another. What we would say colloquially in English, I'm sitting on the fence, and that's a deliberate strategy on my part, because so often the answer to the question is always, it really depends on the pupils that you're working with, because their needs and their preferences should guide you more clearly than anything I might say based on research or principles.
Thank you. I have another question from Julia. What are the best ways to balance teaching literacy and school language while respecting, valuing students' home language?
To be honest, Julia, I think the fact that you've answered the question probably suggests that you're a pretty long way down that road already. I think recognizing the students' home languages, valuing their home languages, encouraging them to read in their home languages, taking an interest in them, prevents there from being what I think there definitely used to be in the UK, the idea that you leave your home language at the school gate and you don't bring that in. I think we've moved on a long way from that, and just taking an interest. And the teachers cannot know all the languages of all the pupils in their class, but helping them to see the connections between the home language and English, that's really powerful, because then they start to understand that languages are not in neat sealed boxes. Languages steal from each other all the time, especially English. We say in English that we borrow words. We don't borrow words because we never give them back. We steal them. And there are those relationships, and children discovering those relationships, I think, can be quite exciting and can lead not just to progress in the target language, but also an excitement and awareness about language for themselves. Any more questions?
Yes, I have a question from Priscilla. I work at a bilingual school in Ecuador, and we try to teach English through an immersive approach. That means we speak English all the time and avoid any use of Spanish in the class. I wonder if that goes in hand with translanguage.
Well, the definition of translanguaging that we use in Wales is that pupils read the material or listen to the material in one language and then they use it in another. Now, one reason for doing this is partly practical, in that although we do have excellent resources in Welsh, there are lots of resources that are only available in English. So if you can get pupils to read something in English and then work in Welsh, then that's beneficial. That might be something that you could do in your context, so that the link between the English isn't something that's completely separate from Spanish. It has a relationship to their Spanish, but obviously, if it's the school policy that you use English all the time, perhaps they might watch a TV program in Spanish and then produce something in English as a result. That is an example of translanguaging as we would use the term in Wales. Although I do understand that there are different definitions.
Thank you. Another question is from Lorena. How can we promote students' conversation using the foreign language, not only with teachers, but among them?
Yeah, that's a really challenging one, isn't it? I think your question is about speaking, but I'm going to say something about writing, because one of the things that's challenging in getting children to write is making sure that they've got something to write about. And I think the speaking language, any kind of language production, is the same. It's important that they've got something to talk about that they're really interested in, because sometimes the tasks that we give children in classrooms are not sufficiently engaging. So if we make sure that what they have to say is important, and give them reasons for speaking in the target language, I think that's the answer, because so often children are reluctant to do things if they don't see the point in it. So they need to know why they're doing this. They need to know why this practice is important. Why is this useful to me? And what do I get out of it? But, that's one of the things where I think using multimodality, giving them something that they're interested to talk about and allowing them to speak about that with that kind of encouragement that they're using the language that you want them to use, I think is probably one way of doing it. But I'm sure there are others.
Absolutely. I have one more question. So how does students' native culture influence their ability to learn a foreign language while living in another country? Are there cultural factors that can either support or hinder language acquisition in classroom?
I'm going to do my sitting on the fence again here. That's a terribly difficult question to answer, because I think it very much depends upon the precise context that the child finds themselves in. I think, if they are part of a community that's using their home language, then that home language is strengthened. But if they're not, if the family is isolated, then obviously there's more need to use the language of the community. And again, so much also depends upon the family context, the languages that parents speak, the way that parents engage with their child's new language, because for some parents it's very, very important that the child learns the language of the community that they live in now, and doesn't keep that their home language. But in fact, the two languages work very well together side by side. So I'm going to go back to one of the points that I made earlier on. I think the answer to that question is about understanding the pupils that you're working with, and beginning to understand the communities that they live in, because this is where the funds of knowledge ideas come in. That the more we know about the context of our pupils' lives, the better position we find ourselves in to teach them.
Thank you. We have a very long question here. I'm going to try to read it. It's from in delay. How can I ensure that all students in linguistically diverse classroom are equally engaged and benefiting from language rotation time? In my classroom, English is the primary language of instruction, but some students speak the second instructional language fluently at home, while others are still learning it. At times, it feels like the students who are still acquiring the second instructional language are more engaged and benefiting from more from language rotation time, while those who are already fluent in it might not be as engaged. The question is, what strategies would you recommend to create a more balanced and meaningful learning experience for all students, regardless of their language proficiency level?
Yeah, that's a really difficult one. It's a difficult question in all kinds of classrooms. How do we pitch the task, whatever it is, so that everyone in the classroom can learn from it? I'm reluctant to give very detailed instructions on this because I'm not that familiar with your context. But one thing that you might think about is the way in which pupils with different language levels might be able to help each other. So can the more fluent pupils help the less fluent ones? Because that mixing of abilities like that can be beneficial to the more fluent pupil, because it's helping them to consolidate their language, and they might find themselves having to explain things that they can do, but they might not be able to explain very well. So they have to explain that to their colleague. And sometimes children benefit from working with other children rather than always with the adult, because the pressure is off. They're not as pressured to get things right if they're working with a fellow pupil rather than with an adult. So that's something that you might consider, right? It's something that I would consider in other classroom contexts, that kind of mixing of abilities to move everyone on. That's one idea.
Thank you so much, Susan, for this very insightful session. Everyone's very happy with the answers. And I can see people from different places in the world, honestly. So more than 150 people attended to this session. We are very happy for that. It's been amazing. So a big thank you to Dr. Susan Chapman for sharing this this expertise with us today. We truly appreciate your time and contributions for in this discussion. And thank you all for joining this session. The engagement was really meaningful. So the recording will be shared with you in the coming emails. We look forward to seeing you in future sessions. So keep an eye on your email because we will be sending you more invitations. The purpose of these activities is to create an opportunity to improve your opportunities to get career development sessions like this one.